Live.
Okay, we are live this morning and good morning, everybody. This is the Senate Transportation Committee and it is Thursday and I believe it's the 13th of January. And we're going to start off this morning with Chris Roop, Federal Infrastructure Bill. Good morning, Chris.
Morning, Senator.
You got some exciting things for us this morning? Ready to
do.
go? Now, we talk about money, we're always excited.
Always. That's absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. So
Go right
if it's
ahead.
all right
It's all
with
yours.
you, thank you, sir. For the record, Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office. If it's all right with the committee, I'm going to share my screen and just walk through a few slides here and give you a
Sure.
high-level overview of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that passed in early November. So
Good. That's great.
if everybody can see that slide
Yep,
on their
yep.
screen.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, let's start off with a high-level overview of what's in the bill. Fortunately, the agency is going to be following me this morning, and they're going to be getting into some of the specifics about how they're approaching implementation of the law, and they can answer some more detailed questions than I can. But I'm going to start dipping your toes in the water this morning, so we all have an understanding of what's in the bill, what it means for Vermont, and what some of the opportunities and challenges are ahead of us to help inform that conversation. So starting off at the high level, the official name of the law is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. You'll see that acronym throughout my slides. But if you've been following the news over most of the past year, you've probably seen this referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So about half of the bill's $1.2 trillion price tag is a reauthorization of the base funding at pre-existing levels. And the other half, roughly $550 billion, represents new levels of funding authorized, typically over a period of 5 federal fiscal years. The largest share of the new funding, roughly $284 billion, is dedicated to transportation. That's what I'm going to focus on today. But the bill also contains sizable investments in other non-transportation forms of infrastructure, like broadband, electric and water utilities, climate resilience, cybersecurity, and environmental remediation. Something very important to keep in mind is that most of the funds are moving through existing or new funding streams that have their own rules and regulations. So this is not like the CARES Act last year, or in 2020 rather, or the ARPA bill last year, where the federal government sent states a large chunk of money up front with a lot of discretion on how to use those dollars for pandemic response. Instead, this bill looks a lot more like what we're used to seeing coming out of Washington: specific funds flowing through funding streams for specific allowable uses. And a lot of these funds have non-federal match requirements. If you've been following over the last year, this bill has evolved quite a bit. It started as a $2.6 trillion proposal and was scaled down throughout the legislative process. This graphic on the right just gives you a sense of what was in the original proposal and what was ultimately left out or scaled down in the finished product. A lot of the elements of the original $2.6 trillion proposal were taken out of this bill and moved into a separate bill that Congress intended to pass through reconciliation on a parallel track. That debate is still ongoing. You can see here that the final law still invests in things much broader than transportation infrastructure, and also contains some significant investments in carbon reduction, electric vehicle infrastructure, and climate resilience, which I'll get into more in a few slides. Let's start looking at the transportation investments at a high level. The IIJA contains $110 billion above base levels for roads and bridges, and $11 billion above base levels for safety. The largest source of federal transportation funding to states is through the FHWA federal aid highway formulas. These formulas have increased substantially over the previously authorized levels in the FAST Act. The federal fiscal year 22 levels are approximately 20% higher than the fiscal 21 levels. And by fiscal 26, the funding levels will be approximately 30% higher than the fiscal 21 levels. There are also 2 brand new formula programs created, one aimed at carbon reduction and another at climate resilience. Another very notable addition is a new $40 billion investment in bridges. Most of this funding will be allocated to states through formula, with a small state minimum of $45 million a year for 5 years, or $225 million total. Other funds will be made available on a competitive basis, on a grant-specific basis. The bill also contains $66 billion of new funding for rail. This represents the largest federal investment in Amtrak since it was created 50 years ago, and a great deal of funding is dedicated for Northeast Corridor modernization. Funds are also available for intercity passenger rail, grade crossing, safety, and infrastructure improvements, mostly on a competitive basis. Airports are also expected to see $25 billion of new funding, with most of the funding channeled through the FAA's Airport Improvement Program. Vermont is expected to receive approximately $28 million over 5 years, and most of that money will go to the Burlington Airport, with much smaller allocations to smaller state-owned airports. Ports and waterways will also receive approximately $17 billion of new funding, but that money is not quite as relevant to Vermont as it is to other states. Let's look at a few key climate-related highlights in the transportation section. The bill contains funding for competitive grants for zero-emission and clean school buses. The bill also contains a brand new $7.5 billion funding stream for EV charging infrastructure. $5 billion of that total is expected to come to states through formula, and we expect that will bring $21 million over 5 years to Vermont. There are also competitive grants for charging infrastructure, and EV infrastructure was added as an eligible surface transportation block grant use. Public transit is slated to see $39 billion of new funding nationwide, and FFIS expects Vermont transit providers will see about $83 million over 5 years, an increase of $22 million over the FAST Act. Within the bucket of public transit funding is additional money for the low or no competitive grants for the purchase of zero emission or low emission transit buses. Vermont has successfully applied for these funds in the past, and this bill represents a significant increase of funding for that pot of money. There's also 2 brand new FHW formula funding streams, which I mentioned earlier. One's aimed specifically at carbon reduction. We're expecting Vermont will receive approximately $33 million over 5 years. Guidance has not yet been issued for this funding stream, but funds can be used for activities that include traffic management, public transit, trails, replacing lighting, developing a carbon reduction strategy, and deploying EV infrastructure. Another new FHWA funding stream called Protect will support climate resilience measures to make our infrastructure better withstand the impacts of climate change. Like with the carbon reduction funding stream, we don't yet have guidance for this new program, but we expect Vermont will receive approximately $37 million over 5 years. I know this chart from FFIS is a little small in hard copy, but it's easier to magnify on your electronic versions on your own devices. But here you can see how the $303.5 billion of Highway Trust Fund contract authority is allocated over the next 5 federal fiscal years. The vast majority of the money, $273 billion of that $303.5 billion total, is distributed through the FHWA formula funds listed at the top. There are also a plethora of competitive programs that states are eligible to apply for. The chart shows you which funding streams are new, and the F or C indicates whether it's a formula or competitive funding stream. Take note of the federal match requirements too. When you see an 80% federal share listed, that means the other 20% of the project costs needs to come from some other funding source. These tables just show a few more details about other funding streams from sources other than the Highway Trust Fund Contract Authority listed on the prior slide. The bill contains $14.4 billion of federal general fund authorizations and $47 billion of advanced appropriations that support some of the new funding streams I mentioned previously. We put a lot of these FFIS summary documents on the JFO website, and there's a link to them on the final slide. There's 8 of them that focus on different sections of the bill and are very good, brief summaries of a 2,700-page bill. So if you want to get a good sense of what all's in the bill and what the key highlights are without wading through all the legislative text, I strongly recommend reading some of those summary documents on the JFO website. And since I'm throwing words like authorizations and appropriations around, it's probably a good idea for a quick refresher on how these federal dollars flow. The country's surface transportation programs are typically authorized on a multi-year basis. And usually Congress gives these bills creative little acronyms, but folks are still trying to figure out how to pronounce this one. These bills create and structure the funding programs, allow them to operate, and establish the contract authority to spend down highway trust fund dollars. It's fairly common for Congress to pass stopgap or short-term extensions as they continue to hammer out the details of what the next reauthorization should look like. This happened several times with the FAST Act. These extensions keep the programs operating and the money flowing, but it's from the highway trust funds to the states. But it is hard for states to do long-term planning when they don't have the certainty of knowing what their future federal funding levels are likely to be. A lot of these programs, especially the FHWA federal aid formula funds, operate through something called contract authority. Contract authority essentially sets the upper limits of funding that can be obligated from the highway trust fund. When funds for a project are obligated, that means the federal government promises to cover that amount of the cost. But sometimes adjustments are made to those obligation limits to control expenditures. There are also some programs that don't function through contract authority and instead resemble the typical federal appropriation process, which is a process you all are familiar with here in Vermont, where you need a second piece of legislation to actually fund the activities that are authorized in the first piece of legislation. And sometimes those subsequent appropriations are made at levels lower than the authorized levels. So as you saw on the previous slide, the IIJA contains some advanced appropriations to fund some of the authorized activities, but not all. Something very important to highlight about these transportation funds is that virtually all of them require a non-federal match. The rule of thumb is that the federal share is typically 80% of a project's cost, but there are some exceptions. For example, the federal government will cover 90% of the cost of an interstate project and up to 100% of the cost for certain safety activities. The match requirement often depends on what's being funded and where the project is. But here's a quick example of how a non-interstate bridge on a federal aid highway like Route 100 or Route 2 would require a different non-federal match than a project on an interstate like I-89. And again, these numbers do not signify a lump sum of money that US DOT sends to the states up front. Rather, these programs usually operate on a reimbursement basis. So if Vermont is given $100 million of contract authority, that means it can obligate and draw down up to $100 million over a period of time. So the state effectively obligates the funds, does the project and incurs the expense, and then gets reimbursed by the federal government for the federal share. States have a significant amount of flexibility for when and how they spend down a lot of these formula funds. Timing is a big consideration. Remember, projects often take multiple years to advance through the process. To accommodate this, the federal government allows FHWA formula funds to be obligated and drawn down for several years after the year they're made available. Usually funds can be obligated for up to 3 years after the year in which they're made available. States also have the ability to flex some of the formula funds between different funding streams, and tools like Tapered Match are available to help states with timing of funds as projects advance. My main point is that you should not think of these funds as use or lose by June 30th, the way we typically think about the budget. Instead, we should also think over a multi-year time period, because the timing of when the federal funds are made available and when the funds are actually drawn down and spent on a project can often differ. So I am here now on slide 11. Most of Vermont's transportation funding comes through these few FHWA formula funds. Here are some high-level bullet points. about these various funding streams. The first one at the top, the National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grants, those are our largest sources of formula funding dollars. The NHPP dollars support a wide range of activities on the state's interstates and major roadways. The STBG dollars are more flexible and also can be used for things like certain bike and pedestrian infrastructure, transportation alternatives, some transit capital projects, and now EV charging infrastructure. The CMAQ funds are also flexible and help support activities that improve air quality and reduce congestion. And this law just added some shared micromobility and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle eligibility to those funds. The other funding streams support freight-related projects, safety, and planning. And as I noted earlier, there are two brand new programs for carbon reduction and climate resilience. Some of these funding streams can be flexed between one another, and it's entirely possible that a specific activity could be an eligible expense under more than one funding stream. I provided some links to the existing FAST Act websites, which have a ton of useful information about each program, but many of these sites have yet to be updated and reflect changes in this law. FHWA is currently updating the websites right now, and information is starting to trickle out, but it's going to take a couple more weeks for us to get the full picture of the guidance and the FAQs for all of the programs that have been added or changed through this bill. So what does all this mean for Vermont? Well, based on estimates from FFIS and the federal government that we've seen so far, we expect at least $2.2 billion will be coming to Vermont from formula funds, $1.4 billion through federal aid highway formula funds over 5 federal fiscal years, which is a substantial increase over the FAST Act, $225 million for bridge replacement and repairs, $21 million for EV charging infrastructure, which could support 110 to 130 new fast chargers, at least $100 million for broadband, approximately $83 million for public transit, according to FFIS estimates, $355 million for water infrastructure, and $28 million for airports. These totals just reflect formula funding estimates. Vermont will also be eligible to apply for a wide range of competitive grants to fund specific projects and initiatives. But overall, when you factor in the increases in FHWA formula funds, the new bridge program, and the EV funds, we're looking at approximately a 53% increase over FAST Act funding levels. Here are the FHWA apportionments Vermont received under the FAST Act compared to what the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is expected to bring. I omitted federal fiscal year 21 because the FAST Act operated under a 1-year extension that year. So we should try to compare 5-year periods to one another. But you can see here that all the formula funds are showing significant increases in federal fiscal 22 over federal fiscal 20 levels. And funds increased by roughly 2% a year in future years. But overall, we're looking at just shy of $1.4 billion of expected formula funds alone in the next 5 years. Now let's take those federal formula funds and also add the new bridge formula funds, transit funds, and EV charging to the list. These are funding streams where we have some good estimates as to what Vermont is likely to expect per year. I compared these expected future levels to the federal fiscal 21 base year to estimate how much new funding we should expect. Then I took those amounts of new funding and applied some non-federal match assumptions of 17.5 and 20%. Again, the actual amounts and timing of these match requirements will vary by project. So you should not read this chart to say that we must spend $274 million in federal aid funds in federal fiscal 23 and come up with an extra 10.4 to 12.3 million in non-federal match in fiscal 23. You should instead view these numbers cumulatively with the understanding that these funds will be drawn down over the course of several years. But based on the amounts of additional federal money we're likely to see from formula funds alone, our additional non-federal match requirements could be at least $109 million to $127 million over a 5-year period of funding authority that can extend across an 8-year period of expenditures. Now, we also need to think about the competitive grant opportunities
Chris,
that we can. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
of that 109 million or 127 million of additional match, where are we allowed to pull that money from? I mean, can we pull it from our existing budgets of projects already planned, or is that's new money? Is that new monies that we have to account for within our budget to match
This
that?
represents additional match above the levels that we've currently been used to. So this represents additional non-federal match that the state would need to require to draw down the 5 years worth of contract authority that we would be getting through these funding streams. So we can draw that down over an 8-year period. So that does provide some flexibility with exactly which year you need to match those, meet those match requirements. But the federal government tends to not say it must come from the T fund or it must come from some other funding source. They'll say, you know, the states have some flexibility on how to come up with the non-federal match, but the feds will only pay this much.
Thank you.
Chris, does that deferred match provision that we used a couple years ago?
Tapered match.
Yeah, tapered, whatever. Does that apply here as well? I mean, obviously, we've been kind of sensitive about this. This was why last year we were reluctant to increase that pure T fund apportionment out to towns, because it meant less money available to help draw down these what were anticipated additional funds. But I just wondered about tapered matching. Would that be able to go beyond that 8-year period?
So tapered match, I don't believe what will allow us to go beyond the 8-year period, but it does allow us flexibility from year to year on the shares of a project's cost that is borne by the feds or the state. So just for some background, when we talk about tapered match, if the feds say we'll pay 80% of the bill for a bridge project that takes 2 years, tapered match allows some flexibility. So the feds may pay a greater share of the expenses up front and the state pay a greater share of the expenses later, so long as the total project's costs do not exceed that sort of 80-20 split. So it gives states a little more flexibility on the timing of meeting the match requirements.
Yes, Senator Bertwick.
Chris, the 109 to 127 additional million, what's the current match that we're coming up with now? Like, what as a percentage, how much more increase does that represent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the match requirement, the match percentages didn't change significantly in this bill from the other bill, but the fact that we're getting, 20 to, I forget the number was, I think it was cumulatively about a 30% increase by FY 26 over previous levels represents, the similar increase in additional match requirements as a percentage. I'm going to show a slide that shows how much federal funding is in the total transportation program in a few slides. But in the book that you all get as part of the transportation process, you can see every single project that's funded with these federal funds and see the match play out. So you'll see, a project costs $1 million and, the federal government will pay 800,000 of it and the T fund would pay the other 200,000. But the amount we spend and match varies from year to year a little bit as projects advance in different timelines.
So oh, sorry.
Just to clarify that point is, so in general, it's around a 30% increase of our match that we need to come up with.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. Okay. And one important point about all this is if you followed along in the debate in Washington, you sometimes heard this talked about as a 5-year bill, sometimes as an 8-year bill. That sort of semantics goes to the fact that this is 5 years of funding authorizations that can be spent down over an 8-year period. So you should read some flexibility into when you specifically need to meet these match requirements by year. But overall, the key theme is we've got a lot of additional match requirement we need to meet in the years ahead to make sure we're not leaving federal cash on the table.
So the transportation plan that we're going to be reviewing, that AOT is prepared, will actually start reflecting this funding with additional projects. I mean,
There-
obviously, this means we can accelerate projects in the pipeline because more money, as long as we can come up with a match. So I know if we pay down the TIB debt, that frees up some, but that doesn't get us close to 109 million. So I assume that, and have you had a chance to look at the plan? Have they submitted it to House Transportation yet?
The TIB plan?
No, not the TIB plan. I'm talking about the transportation plan.
Oh, no,
With-
they have not. They typically do not submit that until the governor presents his budget address and
Yeah,
everybody
okay.
gets it at the same time.
But I would assume that they would start reflecting some of this additional federal money in the plan that we're going to be getting next week then.
Yeah, the agency is going to be following my presentation this morning, and they can get into some more of the details. But a really good point, Senator Kitchell, is that every time you vote on that plan, it includes some federal funding from more than 1 year. So
Right.
You will start to see this show up in the transportation plans that you see in 23. You'll also see some previously authorized years dollars continue to be drawn down. And really a lot of these competitive opportunities that I'm not going to dwell on the next couple slides, but you're going to start seeing those show up more and more in future years because it takes some time for the federal government to stand up more of these competitive programs.
It's going to take the agency to get all these projects in line to finance. Boy, that's a lot of money to get prepared in contracts and to let them out. Then my fear is with all the shortage of employees in the state, are we going to be able to escalate some of these projects for bidding? So it's going to be tough. It's a lot of money, a lot of money.
Do you see
Maybe
any
that-
flexibility? Whoop, go ahead, James, sorry.
Well, what I was thinking was, as long as you got 5 years to spend it, you may in fact want to see if you get beyond this crunch period of time, which is driving higher costs, to sort of look at how you want to space that out, because there's no required annual drawdown. It's just over that
Oh,
5-year period.
It's not annual. It's a total. You have to go with 5 years. That's the way it goes.
It's 1 year plus 3 years after for each. So if you have a federal fiscal 22 authorization, you have 3 years after that to fully draw the money down.
Oh,
May I ask a question?
yeah, go ahead. Richard.
Chris, so one question with really two parts. I'm curious, and it picks up on where Senator Ingalls was coming from. I think I saw in there that this might be $22 million for another 150 fast chargers, those superchargers that are going to be in public locations. For the matching dollars, I'm just concerned, since it's federal monies, like we can't put tolls on interstates. Would we not be able to apply like a state charging fee on those fast chargers? So when I do the math out, if every time somebody plugged into a fast charger, one of those 100, we charged them $1 or $2 just for plugging in, and that'd be state revenues. Would there be, as far as you know, restrictions on using that? And similarly, in the FHWA carbon reduction new formula program, I see intelligent transportation systems. If those intelligent transportation systems were used in some way for use-based assessment, would those use-based assessments collected by the state be valid to use for our state matching dollars?
That is a great question. The answer is maybe, but we don't know yet. And the reason why I say that is these are two new federal formula streams that the guidance has not yet been stood up for yet. So we are working right now off of some pretty vague statutory language that was in the bill that gives you sort of the highlights of how the funding is intended to be used. But it ultimately comes up to the federal agencies then have to take that statutory language and go through what's called the rulemaking process. And they are in that process right now. So that is when they give you all the specifics of what you can and cannot do, how you can do it, and how you can structure it. But your point about the possibilities to generate additional non-federal revenue to draw down to meet the non-federal match is a very valid one. And that is something that you all should explore, because that is how we fund, those themes are how we fund a lot of our transportation program now, is through fees, not just sort of gas taxes and the things we typically think about.
I hope this doesn't get taken out of context, but I'm a fan of use-based assessment. I think it's a rational form of taxation to charge people relative to their use of that infrastructure.
And
One
that's really been
report
the
that
crux of how we fund our infrastructure.
one report that we're having is to see what that revenue impact has had relative to not doing any fee adjustment for well beyond the normal 3-year cycle. And certainly a big area of revenue would be the user fees in transportation. So that, I don't know, last year, I think it was in the vicinity of $7 million was the estimate around what revenues would have been generated if we had done our normal fee adjustment. So that's still out there, but we'll get, what I'm just saying is it'll give you some better idea of what those deferral of fee increases would yield relative to revenues. But it's been a significant impact, certainly in terms of the user fees revenue received.
Absolutely. Okay. Slide 16 and 17, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the universe of competitive grant opportunities that states like Vermont could also apply for. There's several dozen competitive grants. The chart here, which continues on to the next slide, just shows a few key highlights. Now, these grants are different than the formula funds we've talked about thus far. You know, with the formula funds, we have a good estimate of the funding we're likely to see made available. And we often have more flexibility on what we can spend those dollars on and when. With the competitive grants, on the other hand, you know, you're typically submitting an application for funds to do a specific thing. There's less certainty regarding how much you may ultimately get or when or for what, but the competitive grants also typically have match requirements too. So it can take some time for the federal government to stand up these new competitive grant opportunities. So more details will be emerging as we progress through this calendar year. Here on slide 18, I put this chart together just to show you how significant federal funding usually is in the state's overall transportation program. Vermont is very good at matching federal funds, which comprise the majority of the AOT budget, over $361 million of the total $687 million AOT budget as passed this year. You can also see how the federal numbers can fluctuate from year to year. This fluctuation reflects, in part, the fact that so much of the funding is project-driven, and projects proceed at different paces and costs from year to year. So as we've discussed this far, this bill presents many opportunities to make critical investments in Vermont's infrastructure, investments that will benefit the state for many, many years to come. But I don't want you to walk away today thinking we have absolutely nothing to worry about, because we are also facing some pretty significant challenges in the years ahead. You all have heard a lot about how the pandemic has impacted the state's revenues, and usually in a positive way. But the transportation sector has not fared quite as well as other sectors. Our country's transportation sector, as we recently discussed, is large part based on a user fee model. But the pandemic obviously curtailed travel and economic activity, which directly led to revenue losses. And operations and costs can't really always be scaled down to exactly mirror lower demands for service or lower revenues. We've been very fortunate, though, that previous federal bills contained funding specifically aimed at keeping the transportation sector functioning in an environment of lower revenues. The CARES Act back in the spring of 2020, that CRISA bill that passed in December of 2020, and the ARPA bill in the April or so of 2021, each contained funds to help airports, mostly Burlington, and mass transit providers at up to 100% federal cost share. That December 2020 CRISA bill also contained $50.4 million of FHWA surface transportation aid at up to 100% federal share that could be used for a wide range of uses. And much of that money was included in the FY22 transportation program you all voted on last year. Overall, we saw just shy of $137 million of federal pandemic relief coming to Vermont's transportation sector. And those funds went a long way toward offsetting revenue losses and keeping operations moving with minimal disruption. So that's the federal relief picture. Now let's look at what happened with state transportation revenues. We're very fortunate that our state transportation revenues ended up less bad than the first two post-pandemic forecasts expected. But the pandemic still blew a hole of approximately $30 million in our transportation revenues in the two prior fiscal years. This is mostly due to weak demand for motor fuels. When you have more people working from home and less travel, you're going to sell fewer gallons of gas. Fortunately, stronger demand and higher prices for new and used vehicles led the purchase and use tax to surge to record highs, and that offset much of the impact of the weak gas taxes. Year to date, we're slightly below our target, but this trend of stronger than expected purchase and use offsetting weaker than expected gas revenue has continued. Fortunately, the FY22 revenue forecast was upgraded last July, and AOT took management steps earlier in the pandemic to reduce expenditures. The combined impact has resulted in just over $23 million expected on the bottom line of the T fund at the end of fiscal 22 prior to any BAA adjustments. This will give the state a bit of cushion in future years to help meet our higher federal match requirements. But a real cause for concern is that the current revenue forecast expects transportation revenue growth to flatten out in the years beyond 2023. We're going to want to keep paying attention to how gas revenues behave given the trajectory of the pandemic and retail gas prices, as well as what the demand and the inventory levels could mean for vehicle purchases in the months ahead. This chart compares the most recent revenue forecasts so you could see the impact that the pandemic's had on our state transportation revenues. The yellow line shows the January 2020 pre-pandemic forecast and gives you a sense of what folks thought the world would look like before COVID. The red line shows the August 2020 forecast, the first one after the pandemic. And the green line shows that January 2021 forecast. The black line shows our actual collections, which dipped down considerably in FY20 before increasing again last year in FY21. You can see here that the two most recent revenue forecasts upgraded projections and that things didn't end up quite as bad in FY21 as the prior two revenue forecasts expected. The blue line shows the most recent forecast from last July, which upgraded the outlook. This was the first post-pandemic forecast that expected collections to rise above that pre-pandemic level, the yellow line. But that blue line really flattens out after FY23. And the emergency board is meeting later today to adopt a revised revenue forecast. So these numbers are likely to fluctuate once again in the future. The good news is that the last few revenue forecasts upgraded the outlook. However, these higher federal match requirements alone could consume most of the additional forecasted state transportation revenues in the years ahead. For the sake of comparisons, let's use FY21 as a base year. In the 5 years from FY22 through FY26, state transportation revenues are cumulatively expected to yield approximately $133 million of new revenue above that FY21 base level. But revenue growth is expected to flatten out in the years after FY23. We saw on a previous slide that the additional federal formula funds alone could easily require another $109 to $127 million of match to draw down. But again, the actual needs will vary by fiscal year due to project timing issues and the fact that these funds can be spent down over multiple years. We will also need to think about match requirements for federal grants, the competitive grants that the state may apply for, which are not factored into these estimates and would require additional non-federal match. We should also remember that meeting higher federal match needs is not the only growth pressure on the T fund. The T fund also supports the salaries and benefits of many employees, and inflationary pressures are likely to result in higher costs across the board in the near future. The T fund also supports activities that are beyond the AOT base appropriations, such as transfers to other funds. In short, we should expect things could get pretty tight in the years ahead. This chart shows you how the state's transportation funding sources have changed in recent years. Take a look at the
Chris?
bottom of,
Chris, I want to go back. You said transfer to other funds. I believe we only have the one transfer to public safety. Are we transferring other places now? That historically used to be a bone of contention that transportation dollars were used to fund other sort of transportation related. Maybe some of the public transit gets us into that arena, but I know the big one is obviously public safety for highway enforcement. So are there other transfers?
There are several other transfers, but not nearly as significant as the one you mentioned, the transfer to the Department of Public Safety for the state police. The most notable one is a transfer that the T fund makes to the downtown fund. That's in the ballpark of about $500,000 a year.
Okay.
But last year there was a one-time increase of $3.5 million.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I remember that got increased.
So this chart on slide 23 just shows how the funding sources have evolved in recent years. Take a look at the bottom of the FY 20 and 21 columns, and you can see how gasoline revenues took a pretty big dip due to the pandemic. Then beginning in FY 21, the purchase and use tax, those gray segments about halfway up the columns, they significantly increased. In the future years, the purchase and use tax is expected to continue being a larger share of the revenue mix than it was prior to the pandemic. And you can see here that the other miscellaneous fees and the DMV fees are not showing massive projected increases. And again, that's because these fees tend to be reevaluated through the fee bills on an annual basis. But these numbers are going to change slightly after this afternoon when we get a revised revenue forecast. But the key theme here is that gasoline revenues took a pretty big dive during the pandemic. They're projected to come back up, but essentially level off in future years at levels lower than they were, in FY 15 or so. And the purchase and use tax increase we saw in the pandemic is expected to linger to some degree in the future.
Chris or Chair Mazza?
Yes, go ahead.
The car registration fees, would they fall into P&U, DMV, or other miscellaneous?
DMV.
Thank you.
Yeah, the DMV fees are licenses and registrations. So this is my last slide. There's an enormous amount of stuff contained in this 2,700 page bill. And I've just scratched the surface today, but what do you as legislators need to keep in mind right now, pending the additional details being presented from the agency right after me this morning, and when the budget books are going to arrive in a week or so? First off, you should be thinking about the state's ability to meet its future match requirements, especially in the years after FY 23. Our revenues have trended in the right direction recently, but there really is no windfall, and we will want to keep paying attention to how these revenues trend as the state continues to recover and reopen from the pandemic. We will also need to try to be strategic with our use of scarce state funds to leverage federal funds in order to maximize the levels of investment and impact, and also plan for meeting our match requirements for competitive grant opportunities. A big part of this thought process is understanding the opportunity costs of using our federal and state funds. We may be able to identify more than one source of funds to accomplish a priority, but we also need to understand the impact of using that money to do X instead of Y. Inflation is a big consideration across the board. We need to pay attention to the extent to which inflation can eat away at our purchasing power. Labor costs, workforce availability, contractor capacity, and supply chain challenges are all factors that could be significant. We are seeing a ton of money flooding states at the same time, and those states will all be trying to draw down from a talent pool and supply chain that isn't going to expand instantaneously. We also need to always be mindful of the broader economic recovery, since factors like fuel prices, interest rates, travel patterns, and discretionary consumer income all impact what we will collect in transportation revenues. We will also want to pay attention to the volume and the timing of projects in the pipeline, since those determine when we will spend down our federal dollars and when we need to meet our match requirements. And as we've seen from other large federal funding bills, it's going to take some time for the federal agencies to implement the bill. They need to issue the revised guidance and rulemaking, FAQs, stand up new competitive grants, issue funding notices and awards, etc. And they're going to do this while states are trying to finalize their fiscal 23 budgets. So we should expect some adjustments. We should also make sure all of these authorizations contained in this bill ultimately get funded by Congress in the months and years ahead at the levels we're expecting, to make sure that those appropriations support the authorizations and states are getting the money that they expect. I provided a few links here on the last slide here where you can go directly to some of the summary materials that are on the JFO website. As we see more useful documents come out through our advocacy partners at the federal level and through services like FFIS, we try to post those summary documents here to make them available and as a good resource. A few fact sheets from the White House as well. And there's some good slides and a link here. If you sort of want an FHWA 101 on the federal formula funds, there's a great document here in that third link as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and answer any other questions that you may have for me. If you have anything particularly detailed or specific, the agency who's going to be coming right after me this morning will be in a better position to talk about how they plan to implement the funds, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of what the high level overview is and what some of the key considerations and concerns you all should be thinking about in the near future.
How many pages did you say that bill was?
It's about 2,700.
Oh my God.
I read most of them, but I don't remember them.
I think you did a great job. I'll tell you. Oh my God. That's
Thank
a
you.
lot of information.
Maza.
Yes, go right ahead.
Chris, say we're getting close to our 5th year and we still have quite a bit of money to draw down. Does it allow for us to say, okay, we don't really have any more new projects, but here's our budget for transportation. Can we use those monies to supplement the transportation budget? Maybe the state can use the monies that were going to go to the transportation budget elsewhere in the state that were for other monies that were needed. I mean, can you mix and match with that, and as long as we can supply the match, or is it all just for new projects?
No, that's a great question. I have no doubt that the agency can identify ways to spend all of this money on critical infrastructure improvements. But one interesting thing about some of these FHWA formula funds is that, it's not just roads and bridges that are eligible. So there is opportunities to flex dollars between different programs, flexing NHPP dollars to the surface transportation block grant dollars, for example, and then use some of that more flexible STBG money to do things that you may not necessarily think about as like core roads and bridges, but things like transportation alternatives and pedestrian improvements and things that still help folks get around and build strong communities, but sort of gets beyond the nuts and bolts of what we think of as a typical like highway project. So there's a range of possibilities here. And one of the really interesting things about this bill is, for the first time, there's some dedicated formula funds aimed at climate change initiatives. And in the past, we've had to be very creative with how we fund those. We've had to do it sometimes with 100% state dollars from our T fund, sometimes using VW settlement funds and things of that nature. We now, for the first time, are having some dedicated funding streams for EV infrastructure and climate mitigation that aren't going to be competing with other core transportation priorities. So there's still a lot of details that need to be released from the agencies on those funding streams, but it presents a really interesting opportunity. There's also some discussion in Washington, and there's been some advocacy out there about allowing states to use some of their ARPA funds to meet match requirements in the infrastructure bill. That is not real until Congress makes it real, but that would present some very interesting opportunities to sort of leverage some of the federal funds we already have to draw down more federal funds. One thing that Senator Kitchell touched on, and you're going to hear more details about in the future this morning about the BAA proposal, is a key element of the agency's BAA proposal is to use some of the unspent federal FHWA funds we got last December at 100% share to pay off the balance of our outstanding TIB bonds. If you do that, that frees up not only does that save interest costs over time, $3.9 million of cumulative interest costs, but it frees up the $2.5 million we're currently spending in debt service in the TIB fund to either leverage more federal dollars and meet our match requirement on a pay-go basis, or if we find things getting really tight by FY25 or several years in the future, it gives us the ability to then go to market if we need to issue a fresh round of bonds and basically use that existing debt service capacity to use more, to do a new bond issue that could then be used to meet additional non-federal match. So the agency and the treasurer are not proposing doing that at this stage, but it gives you that flexibility should it be needed down the road.
There's no doubt that the AOT was going to have, we've seen the list of future projects and we're sure it's going to grow. Touching more on what you said earlier about it would just be too bad that if we couldn't get these projects done, to leave that money on the table. And so that flexibility, I think, is really key as far as to help us, and spend that money wisely and spend it all if it's available to us.
And if I could just add, that's a great point. Vermont is extremely good at not leaving federal dollars on the table. The agency actually has a very good track record of scooping up other federal dollars that other states have left on the table. But one other key consideration, and I want to really underscore this, is inflation is something we really need to pay attention to, because not only in the labor force, but in the commodities market, energy prices, the price of steel, the price of concrete. All of this is could be a real concern in the years ahead, because these dollars may end up not buying as many projects as we thought they would too. So that's another key consideration.
Yeah, I talked to some of the pavers already, and number one, the product is going through the roof and the labor is going through the roof. So you're right. What used to cost you $1,000 a mile, for example, it's going to be $5,000 a mile. And
let's hope not.
Well, no, but it's not that much, but it's going to be a factor. Yeah.
Chris, is there any flexibility to move money from different buckets within that federal bill, because it has allocations in a variety of areas? Is there any flexibility? So, for example, clean water. We have state dollars on as well for clean water. I'm just wondering if like as Senator Ingalls said, well, we couldn't just do it on transportation projects or make it work. But are those federal dollars that are federal highway, are they sort of locked into that particular use, or is there does the law have any flexibility around movement between the different funding buckets?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's flexibility within some of those FHWA formula funds, but the same level of flexibility doesn't exist for flexing FHWA funds to funds that might be going like through the EPA instead.
Okay.
So there are a lot of, we talk about this as an infrastructure bill, and everybody thinks of infrastructure as roads and bridges, but this bill contains the water and the water development reauthorization as well, and a few other reauthorizations.
Broadband is in there.
Yeah, there's not as much ability to flex the dollars between federal agencies, but
okay, all right. Just thought I would ask. That would expand, options.
How much of this passes down to the towns? Is there
That's a great question. There are some set-asides. There's some set-asides in the formula. So there's a set-aside for the new bridge formula program for off-system bridges that would typically be town bridges that are up to 100% cost share. But aside from that, most of these funds flow directly to the states. And then, the states spend that money and can't really give it as sort of like a blank check to a town. But there are some set asides for funding dedicated to that. And that's how we fund some of our current town highway programs, as well as through like STBG set aside requirements. But the towns do have opportunities to apply for competitive grants in many cases. And those are often coordinated through the RPCs. But when I worked back at the city of Philadelphia, our great tension was always states really like the formula funds and the cities and towns really like the competitive funds, because the competitive funds are where the locals often have a direct bite at the apple of getting direct funding. So there's opportunities for both.
One of the things the towns did get was ARPA money. I think it was 176 million. And we put money in the budget so that the League of Cities and Towns and our RPCs could work with the towns to make sure that they were taking sort of the maximum advantage of those dollars for long range, and also to make sure that they were using them in a permissible way, and also to help them meet the requirements, the fiscal, the reporting requirements and so forth. And it was really rewarding, because in reading some newspaper or some articles, a number of municipalities, cities, or counties actually didn't take the money because of the complexity. They just didn't want to deal with the federal requirements. And in Vermont, only one town did not apply and get that money. So, and the feedback has been certainly that having the resources of the league to assist them and the RPCs to assist them, and really made the difference in terms of their comfort in moving forward and accessing the money. But I thought that was pretty impressive. Only one town out of the entire state opted not to access those dollars.
Okay, yes, Senator Bertschlick.
Yeah, thanks. So, Chris, thanks for the presentation. When you gave us some cautionary comments about the federal appropriation going forward, and I'm wondering if one of those is that the fact that the Federal Highway Trust Fund is, doesn't have enough money going into it, and so part of this contract authority, I'm assuming, requires the federal government to keep putting money into the Federal Highway Trust Fund from other sources, because there's not enough money from the gas tax, right? So would that be another concern or another potential bump in the road if they can't agree on funding the trust fund?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're absolutely right that there are some appropriations from the general fund into a lot of this, and that includes, we typically see Washington put transfers from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund, because the Highway Trust Fund's primary source of revenue is the federal gas tax, which is 18.4 cents a gallon and has not been increased since I was in first grade. And needless to say that it doesn't have the purchasing power that it did back then. I think quite honestly, the reason why things haven't been fully funded is a little less a matter of disagreement on funding these like a philosophical disagreement, and more just a reflection of the fact that the federal appropriations process doesn't work as smoothly as a lot of people wish it would. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes.
And on that too, Chris, if we as a country head towards electrification, that fund's even going to be depleted even more. I mean, so it's going to be even less of an option for us.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And one of the interesting things that is contained in this bill that I did not touch on is there is language to give FHWA the ability to explore some multi-state pilot programs around like vehicle miles traveled proposals to sort of see what it looks like to get away from the gas tax, because I think the gas tax is not going away tomorrow. The gas tax is going to be a part of our funding stream for a very long time. but its purchasing power is going to continue its downward trajectory. And we've seen it go down up to this point, in partially due to the fact that we've had higher rates of EV adoption in the last few years. It's mostly due to the fact that our cars are just way more efficient now, even conventional cars, than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So we're selling fewer gallons of gas. And you're absolutely right that as the electrification trend continues, that trend will accelerate. It will take some time to get there, but it heightens the sort of importance of figuring out what the and is to our funding stream system in this country, because we're going to need to figure out how to replace that revenue source, not only at the federal level, but every state levies a gas tax, and they're all facing the same issues.
Sure.
Yes. Chittenden.
Pick up on that point, Chris. I completely agree. And that's why I'm really intrigued by slide 6, where it talks about the FHW carbon reduction new formula program, including intelligent transportation systems and replacing streetlight and signals. I think that's where the answer is going to ultimately rest, and having just smarter roads to assess usage, just like we do with gas taxes. So I'd love to hear more about that. Or if you have more information about what the federal government is giving guidelines with those ITS systems, I'd love to see that.
Absolutely.
Any other questions, comments? Chris, excellent job like always.
Thank you,
Very
Senator.
thorough, very, that's a good update about where we are. That was helpful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, committee, if anything else, we'll take a 15-minute break. We'll see you at 10:15.
Are we going offline?
Yes.